This is the Thoughts from a Page podcast, where I interview authors about their latest works. Listen to what inspired the storyline, how their covers and titles were chosen, their personal connection to the story, and other fascinating tidbits about the authors themselves. My name is Cindy Burnett, and I love to talk about books. I can be found on Instagram and Pinterest at Thoughts from a Page, and if you have comments about the podcast or feedback for me, I can be reached at cindyhburnett@att.net. I have thoroughly enjoyed hearing from several listeners recently. John Cribb is a best-selling author who has written about subjects ranging from history to education. His writing has been published in the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, the Chicago Tribune, National Review Online, and several other publications. Old Abe is John's first novel. Abraham Lincoln has been his hero from history since boyhood, when he read about Abe growing up on the frontier. John lives in his hometown of Spartanburg, South Carolina. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy this show. Welcome, John. I really enjoyed reading Old Abe, and I look forward to speaking with you about it. How are you today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me, Cindy.
Well, let's start out with you telling me a little bit about Old Abe.
Well, it is a historical fiction about Abraham Lincoln, as you might guess from the title. And it basically follows Lincoln through the last 5 years of his life. So it picks up in the spring of 1860 when he's nominated for president and follows him right on through the end of his life, those last 5 years, which are among the most tragic years in our nation's history. But you are at his side, at his elbow, every chapter, every scene as he goes through his presidency and the Civil War. There are some chapters that are iconic events from American history, like the Gettysburg Address or the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. But then there are a lot of those lesser known moments that make a life in full, like the afternoons he's standing over the hospital beds, looking down at the faces of wounded soldiers, both Union and Confederate, or the night that the White House stables caught on fire and he rushed out and tried to get in to save his boys' ponies and goats because he knew they were inside. So events like that. But everything that I write about happened. Sometimes I condense events. And of course, I had to leave a lot out, but I really tried to make it as historically accurate as I could. It is fiction, but I really wanted to try hard to give an accurate depiction of what happened during those 5 years.
Why did you decide to write a fictional versus non-fictional account of Abraham Lincoln?
Well, a couple of reasons, I guess. First of all, there are thousands of books out there about Lincoln, as your listeners may know. About 10 years ago, somebody started to count all the Lincoln books, and he got up to 15,000, and I think he stopped, because actually I think more than that. And of course, that was 10 years ago, so there's certainly more since then. They say there are more books about Lincoln than anybody in history other than Jesus Christ, and that may well be true. But the overwhelming majority of them are nonfiction. And so I wanted to try fiction for a couple of reasons. Number one, because there are a lot of nonfiction books out there about him. I really wanted to try to bring him alive. And as we know, fiction can do that in a way that nonfiction cannot. So that was one of my primary aims in this was to bring him alive.
Well, the personal aspect of the story definitely resonated with me. What you mentioned a little bit ago about being there with him every step of the way, kind of his perspective of what was happening. I really, really liked that.
Great, because I think the fun thing about the novel that you really learn who he was as a person, and you learn that through, as I say, those moments that make up a life in full. Like there's a chapter, for example, where he attends a seance with his wife, Mary. They've lost a son in the White House, Willie, which is just devastated, both of them, but her in particular. And she begins to grasp for ways to cope with all the loss that surrounds them, not just their son, Willie, but just so much death and destruction that's going on. And spiritualism was very popular at the time. So she starts to consult spiritualists. And so Lincoln is a little concerned about it, but he says, well, I'll come to a seance with you. So I think it's the opening chapter of part 3 in the book depicts this scene. And is actually, I draw from, as I do through so much in this book, primary source materials. One of the people that was at the seance with them wrote about it. So there's a detailed record of it. And then I drew from other sources too that describe seances from that time. But this kind of thing that you don't normally really read about in Civil War histories, I think is what really helps make the character come alive.
How did you decide to write about him?
Well, I've been a Lincoln fan for a long time, really since I was a kid, but it had never occurred to write a novel about him, even though I've always wanted to write a novel. I was an English major in college at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. So I'm a literature guy, but I've been writing my whole professional life, but for the most part, it's been nonfiction. But in 2006, I checked out of the libraries in Spartanburg, where I live, Spartanburg, South Carolina, Carl Sandburg's landmark 6-volume biography of Abraham Lincoln. It's probably the most beautifully written of all the nonfiction biographies, especially the first 2 volumes, the Prairie Years, about his life before the White House. But I was plowing my way through these 6 volumes, and at the same time, I reread Irving Stone's wonderful novel about the life of Michelangelo, The Agony and the Ecstasy, which is an older book. But I'd read that in high school for an AP European history class. And so I decided to reread it. And that got me to thinking, could you do the same thing for Lincoln that Irving Stone did for Michelangelo? And that was the original idea behind the book, was this kind of Irving Stone, James Michener type of book that would cover Lincoln's whole life from his youth on the frontier through the end. And that just proved too unwieldy for me, especially, as a first-time novelist. But anyway, as it went on and I cut it and edited and sliced it, it became the book that it is, Old Abe, which is the last 5 years of his life. That's kind of the genesis of it was way back in 2006 when I read those 2 books.
Well, you must have had to do an incredible amount of research. And once you narrowed your topic, I guess that helped a little bit in terms of figuring out where to focus your research. What all did you research? And then how did you decide what to narrow it down to?
Well, the research, I guess, took 3 general forms. First, a lot of book reading. And the last time I counted on my bookshelves in my office at home where I work, I had about 250 books about and related to Abraham Lincoln. So everything from general biographies about Lincoln to books about life in the Civil War, that kind of thing. A lot of books, old books by people who knew Lincoln and had interactions with him and wrote about that. That kind of firsthand account was invaluable for my work. So a lot of books, and then a fair amount of internet research. There's some fantastic Lincoln sites out there, like the Lincoln Papers at the Library of Congress. You can go online and see his original papers in his handwriting, digital versions of them, like the Gettysburg Address. Like there's a great site called Mr. Lincoln's White House, where you can go online and they have a map of the White House, a diagram of the floor plan during his day. And you can click on any of the rooms and it'll pull up pictures of what it looked like when he was there and, stories of things that took place in those rooms. So the amount of Lincoln scholarship out there, even long before the internet came along, is amazing. I mean, there have been generations of historians and scholars at work in the field of Lincoln studies, and my book certainly would not exist without their efforts. And then a lot of travel that I got to do to Lincoln sites. I've been to every Lincoln site you can think of, from his birthplace at Sinking Spring Farm in Kentucky to, of course, Ford's Theater, where he was assassinated, but places like battlefields he went to. And one of my favorite Lincoln sites that your listeners might like to visit next time they're in Washington, when Washington opens up again, is the Lincoln Cottage, or the President's Cottage in Northwest DC. It was kind of the Camp David of its day. It's where the Lincolns spent their summers. It was kind of on the edge of town up in the hills. It was a little cooler, catch some breezes, a little quieter. Lincoln would commute to the White House. It was about 3 miles from the White House, so he commuted every day. But you can go there. It's open to the public. It's probably not open right now, but when coronavirus is over, you can go and visit it. It's one of these places where you literally can come into contact with Lincoln's world, because when you go up and down the staircase there, they'll let you put your hand on the banister that he put his hand on when he went up and down. So you can literally touch his world, which for a Lincoln geek like me, is a big deal, because there are not that many places you can do that. But anyway, walking the territory, the land that he walked in places like Washington or New Salem, a little frontier village he lived in Illinois, that was invaluable for our research to try to soak up the atmosphere. And often the volunteers, the park rangers, the historians, the docents that work in places like that are they are experts in that one slice of Lincoln's life. So their insights were absolutely invaluable to my research.
As you mentioned, there are so many books out there, so many websites, locations you can visit, and being able to
Yeah.
focus and get your book written. I just think that would be kind of hard, especially in this instance with someone like Lincoln, who is such a prominent figure, so well regarded and so written about.
Yes. Well, it was hard, and I made it probably harder than it should have been. And actually, what forced me to narrow it down was just the realization there was no way I was going to get the book that I originally had in mind published, which was this gargantuan 1,000-page, like I say, James Michener type book. So I just had to choose. And I I don't know that his White House years are fascinating, of course, and that's what people really are most interested in. So that's one reason I zeroed in on that. And because there's kind of a defined beginning and end to it, I begin when he's nominated for president, and then, as I say, follow him to the end. That was a good way to force me to have a natural place where I was going to start and a natural place where I was going to end.
One of the things I was not aware of until I read your book was that the talk of assassinating Lincoln started almost as soon as he was elected.
Yes, as soon as he was elected, even before he became president, he was elected, of course, in November of 1860. And back then, they took office in March. Today, we do the inaugurations in January. Back then, it was in the month of March. So he had several months there. He stayed in Springfield, Illinois, during those months. Right away, as soon as he was elected, he started getting death threats and reports of rumors of assassination plots. There were reports of plots to poison him while he was still in Illinois, and there were reports were reaching him from Washington that there were plots to kill him as soon as he got to Washington, to shoot him. He got death threats in the mail while he was still in Illinois. For example, he got a painting from South Carolina that showed him with a noose around his neck and his feet chained and his body tarred and feathered. When he took the train to Washington, the special train that took him to Washington to be president, when he got to Philadelphia, and they pulled him aside and said, "We've got a serious problem. There's a plot to kill you in Baltimore as you pass through Baltimore." So the well-known detective James Pinkerton met with him. So he decided to change his plans. He actually took a separate train, kind of under the cover of night, without telling anybody. They snuck him onto it, and they basically smuggled him to Washington to avoid this assassination attempt. He took a lot of grief for that in the press afterwards, but that's how he came into Washington.
Well, that just was interesting to me because, obviously everyone knows how the story ends, but I didn't realize that was something that was from just the second he was elected on was an issue that they continued to try to deal with and avert.
Yes, and not to spoil anything for readers, but there's in the book depicts another assassination attempt that took place while he was president that narrowly missed him. His good friend Hill Layman, who kind of served as he was unofficial bodyguard throughout his administration, was very concerned the whole time he was going to be assassinated, especially after Robert E. Lee surrendered. He told Lincoln, "You're at more danger now than you have ever been because passions are so high." And I think Lincoln did not really believe him, unfortunately.
You did a great job of portraying how divisive it was and how divisive it was when the war was at an end and how upset the Southerners were. And that stayed with me when I finished the book.
Oh, well, thank you. One of the remarkable scenes to me, and I think one of my favorite chapters in the book, is after Richmond has fallen. So this is the very end of the war. Robert E. Lee's army is still in the field, but Richmond falls, and Lincoln is down at City Point, Virginia, which is a huge Union depot down the Appomattox River from Richmond. And when he hears that Richmond has fallen, he says, "I'm going to Richmond." And he gets on a boat with about a dozen Marines and a couple of officers, and his young son Tad he takes with him, and they go up the James River. And this is a true story. he walks into Richmond, and there was supposed to be some soldiers there to meet him, but they didn't realize he was coming when he was coming. And so he's just got this small, group of soldiers around him, and he walks through the city. And of course, the city is in a state of shock, and it's still burning. There's block after block of just burned destruction. Because as the Confederates evacuated, they set some warehouses afire, and the fire spread. But the utter defeat and shock of the Southern people, he just comes face to face with. And it's the kind of thing that would just obviously never happen in today's world. But it happened.
I was riveted by that because, yes, it would never happen today. There's no possible way, but that he was able to do that and that he survived it.
Yes. And he wanted to see the house known as the White House of the Confederacy, where Jefferson Davis and his family lived in. So he found it, and they went inside, and he sat down, and he said, this must have been President Davis's chair. He kind of got a tour of the house. It's just really unfathomable that this was going on, but that's what happened.
I liked the part talking about Mrs. Davis and how she wanted the house left clean and ready for them to show up. I thought that showed a lot of grace on her part.
Isn't that great? It's such a Southern thing too. You have your house ready for your guests, even if it's people you've just been fighting. And that's true. That is one of those details that, I didn't make that up. That the people that were in the house with Lincoln, they described all of that. So I drew from all of that. And that's what he told them when he got there. He said, Mrs. Davis asked me to have the house ready for you. And of course, there was a much closer connection than I think most people realize between North and South. And these people who were fighting each other, they knew each other. For example, Abraham Lincoln and the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens from Georgia, were friends. They had served in Congress together. They were both Whigs in Congress. And I think Lincoln was very disappointed when Alex Stephens was named vice president and took the job. But it's just one example of how complicated this was. Mary Todd was from a slaveholding family. And so her brothers were fighting for the Confederacy. At one point, her sister, when her husband, who was fighting with the Confederacy, was killed, she comes with her daughter to the White House and stays with the Lincolns. So and I hope I've conveyed some of that in the book. Part of the tragedy is that these were people. It really was family against family. It's just not a cliche.
You most definitely did. And I think that's partly what made the story so captivating.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that, because that was my point. As I say, one of my aims was to try to bring him alive as a walking, talking, breathing fellow, and the people around him, and not just that stiff image that we see on the penny or the $5 bill. And as I say, that's why I really wanted to try historical fiction with this.
How did you come up with the title for this one? Again, with 15,000 plus books on Abraham Lincoln, there's probably a lot of titles that weren't available.
Yes, and titles and covers can be very tough because you got to get a lot of people to agree on them. It took a while to get that. And I had all kinds of titles I tried on this book, everything from just Abraham Lincoln, which is, of course, very boring. And there have been books called Abraham Lincoln. But I think the worst title I had was Spirit of Mortal Be Proud. Sounds like a romance novel or something. It's a line from Lincoln's favorite poem that he learned when he was young. But the title Old Abe, I was editing the book, and there's the place where his kids, when he's been elected and they're on the way to Washington, I think is when they're singing this campaign song that was Old Abe came out of the wilderness. I think it's to the tune of the Old Gray Mare. Old Abe came out of the wilderness, out of the wilderness. And as I was reading that, it just kind of struck me right across that nickname Old Abe, which people called him that during the campaign, and it was just kind of a nickname for him. And I thought, oh, well, that's Old Abe. But I thought, well, that's so obvious. Surely there are lots of books called Old Abe. So, of course, I went to Google, and surprisingly, there's not really any book recently called Old Abe anyway. So I jumped on it. That became the title.
Well, I think it's a great title, and I was happy while I was reading to come across what you were just describing, where the name came from, to kind of tie in with why you chose it for the title.
Yes, good.
Are you working on anything at the present that you would like to share with me?
Well, I am. As I say, this book was originally envisioned to be this giant book that takes him from frontier days to his death. So I have a good working manuscript for a book that covers Lincoln's time from his teenage years on the Indiana frontier through the Lincoln Douglas debates. It's a little bit different kind of book because it covers a longer time period than 5 years. But I'm working on that. I think that there's definitely a book there. It's just a matter of massaging it and editing it and doing the kinds of things you got to do after you get a draft to turn it into a book. So I'm hoping if Old Abe does well enough, that the publisher will want to do the earlier part of his life.
Well, good. Well, I look forward to reading that when it makes its way out into the world.
Great. I hope it'll come to be.
What do you like to do when you're not writing or reading?
Well, as of this week, my wife and I are empty nesters. We're temporary empty nesters anyway, because we have two daughters. One of them is a rising junior at Furman University here in South Carolina, and the other is a freshman at Clemson, also in South Carolina. So they just went to campus a little late because of coronavirus, but they are both on campus now, and hopefully they'll be able to stay there through. I think after Thanksgiving, everybody's coming home. But we're suddenly empty nesters, so we've got we're kind of rediscovering what to do with our free time. Although to be honest, I haven't really had any free time at all since this book has come out. But I like to sail. We have a sailboat, a Catalina 30 on Lake Hartwell, which is on the Georgia-South Carolina border. It's known as the west coast of South Carolina. It's a big lake. Like to be on the water. A few years ago, my daughter Molly and I, we kayaked from Spartanburg, which is in the right at the foot of the mountains in South Carolina. We kayaked across the state to Charleston, down the rivers to Charleston, which was a lot of fun. Love hiking. We have a place in the North Carolina mountains, so I love hiking. And I'm not a great cook at all, but I've been making lots of salsa this summer. I've become the salsa king with the peppers we've grown in our gardens and the tomatoes. And I made a great killer peach salsa that I've worked up. So that was one of my summer fun things to do.
It's fun to hear things that people have learned to do during the pandemic as life has slowed down a little bit and we're all home more. Everybody's taking on a new hobby, and I always enjoy hearing what those are.
Yeah, that was mine, making salsa.
Oh, that's a good one.
Yeah.
Well, before we wrap up, I would love to hear what some of your favorite recent reads are.
Well, this is a little different. These are oldies but goodies, but they are what I've been reading recently. One of them is really old. It's Metamorphoses by Ovid, which I think was written around 8 AD. And I'm not reading it in Latin, although I did take lots of Latin in school, but it's all left me. It's a translation by Rolf Humphreys, and I've had it forever, but it's been forever since I've read it. And it is just one of those well springs of Western literature that's worth going back to again and again. It's a long, long poem. A lot of the versions of the Greek and Roman mythology that we know of the famous stories, like Phaeton and the Minotaur, Theseus and the Minotaur, and King Midas and the Golden Touch, are actually come out of Ovid. He retold all of those stories. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. So I've been rereading Ovid, which I haven't read in many, many years. Ovid's Metamorphoses. And the other one is actually older too, but one of my favorite short story writers in the world is Frank O'Connor, the Irish short story writer. His real name was Michael O'Donovan, but he wrote under the pen name Frank O'Connor. And I'm sure many of your readers know him. I first ran across him in college, fell in love with him. I just think he's one of the masters of the art of short story. So every once in a while, I will go back and read through his collected short stories. So that's one thing I've been doing recently. He just writes beautifully of the Irish countryside. So if your listeners aren't familiar with Frank O'Connor and they like short stories, I would highly recommend they check him out because he's one of the masters of the 20th century when it comes to short stories.
I read a few of his short stories in college, but I haven't read anything by him since then.
Yeah, well, it's worth going back and rereading him because he really wrote so beautifully.
Well, I really appreciate your taking the time to join me today. It's been a delight to talk with you about Old Abe.
Well, thank you for having me, Cindy. I really loved talking with you.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, Please follow me on Instagram at Thoughts From a Page. Tell all of your friends about the podcast and rate it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. John's book can be purchased at Murder by the Book, where I work part-time, and the link is in the show notes. Thanks to KP Regan for the sound editing, and I hope to see you next time.
I'm Allison Holland, host of the Kennedy Dynasty podcast. Equipped with a microphone and a long-term fascination of the Kennedy family, I am joined by an incredible cast of experts, friends, and guests to take you on a fun, relaxed, yet informative journey through history and pop culture. From book references to fashion to philanthropy to our modern expectations of the presidency itself, you'll see that there is so much more to Kennedy than just JFK or conspiracy theories. Join me for the Kennedy Dynasty podcast.